transmitted from person to person.
Okay.
But the details of that transmission were cloudy. Now, in 1918 and 1919, 600,000 Americans died, and worldwide, the conservative estimate is that 50 million people around the world succumbed to this Spanish flu. And some people say that's woefully under the mark, that probably more than 100 million died as a result of that influenza. But again, public health then was not necessarily up to tracking all of the illnesses and deaths that were caused by that virus at that time. But one thing to keep in mind, the mortality rate of that H1N1 so-called Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, was 2%. So if you get 50 million to 100 million deaths from a virus that only had a 2% mortality,
wow.
You see, it doesn't have to be all that lethal to get huge numbers of deaths. And the death rate in some places was so immense, right here in the United States, that they could not bury all of the bodies. And so mass graves were dug, and hundreds of corpses were just, they had crews that went through neighborhoods collecting bodies from homes, and they would just throw them into big pits and sprinkle lye on the bodies and just cover them up in hopes that that would in some way prevent others from becoming infected.
Well, that seems to be, because one of the things that we're looking at is, of course, the World Health Organization just stopped tracking the cases now. You know, they said they're not going to even keep track because it's too broad for them to even do that. So we may be entering a situation where we don't even know what the real numbers are.
Well, you're right. We don't know what the exact numbers are, but we know that they're astronomical.
Right.
For every reported case that the CDC was reporting and WHO was reporting, you could pretty much multiply whatever that reported number was by 10,000.
Right.
That there were that many infections, and only 0.1% of the cases actually got reported to the CDC or were verified by specific testing. Okay, so probably as we speak in the United States, there are several million infections that have already occurred, and throughout the world, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people have already been infected by this H1N1 virus. Let me emphasize that as the virus has been in the late spring and early summer of 2009, it is a relatively mild virus.
Okay.
And has only been responsible for a relatively small number of deaths globally. But the great fear is that this virus is now incubating in the bodies of millions and millions of people around the world, and as it incubates within the flesh and blood of all of these human beings, there's the potential for it to mutate into a more virulent form, so that then this mutated swine flu that emerges in the fall and winter of 2010 could actually be the devastating killer that we saw in 1918 and 1919. No one knows for sure. One thing that we can watch, those of us who live in the northern hemisphere, watch what's going on in the southern hemisphere, because while we're experiencing our summer season, they're in the middle of their winter season. And when we look at South America, in Argentina, and Chile, and South Africa, Australia, all of these countries in the southern hemisphere, their public health systems are being devastated by the number of flu cases. And the deaths are relatively small at the present time. But again, It means that the virus is actively moving through the human population of this planet. And the influenza virus, by its very nature, is the most mutagenic virus that is known. Not only can it mutate itself into something more lethal, and of course the mutation could go the other way. It could become less lethal. But it not only does it have the capacity to mutate within itself, but it also has the capacity to recombine with other viruses that may also be present in the environment. So now, pay attention to this, because this is where the true nightmare scenario could actually unfold. There is another virus in the world since about 2003, 2004, that is popularly called the bird flu. Okay, we're done with the swine flu, H1N1, but there's a H5N1 virus that is called the bird flu. And people who have been keeping up with the news over the last 5 years or so have heard numerous reports about outbreaks of bird flu among birds. So in Asia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, and other countries around the world, they have literally had to slaughter millions and millions of chickens, ducks, and other birds when an epidemic of this bird flu broke out among those flocks. Now, people who work in the poultry industry are at high risk of catching this bird flu. It's not a human flu, but every now and then this virus figures out a way to jump from one species to another. And so there have been something like 400 or 500 deaths over the last 5 or 6 years due to this bird flu. Now, we talked about the mortality of the H1N1 from 1918 being 2%. The human mortality rate from H5N1, the bird flu, is 56%. In other words, it does not jump from birds to humans very easily. But when it does,
devastation.
56% of the people who become infected with this bird flu die. So now, it has not become epidemic among humans because it passes very easily from bird to bird. So that as we sit here on this patio deck, every bird that flies over our heads is probably infected with the H5N1. So it's endemic among birds. Usually it doesn't make birds sick. They just become carriers of it. But virtually every bird on this planet is now infected with H5N1. And occasionally a human being will catch it from a bird. But when that human being catches it, it's very difficult for that human being to transmit it to another human being. So it has never spread in an epidemic fashion. Now let's
now I see where you're going.
Now let's switch to the H1N1, the so-called swine flu, that seems to have no trouble at all spreading from person to person. Now suppose, even though there's just a handful of human bird flu cases, suppose the H1N1, in other words the swine flu, and the bird flu infect the same person. So that now you have a reassortment or recombination of H1N1 with H5N1, the swine and the bird flu combined, in other words.
Now you got your new.
Now suppose that new virus that results from that recombination, suppose it retains the easy human-to-human transmission characteristic, and suppose it also retains the high lethality of the bird flu. Now you have a virus that would spread easily from person to person and has a 56% mortality rate. Now you're talking about a mass killer.